Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. In today's video, I want to tell you about the Dialogue Cabin quilt that's behind me and why I think it's a great quilt pattern for linen and solid shirts. And I have a lot to say about it, so let's get started. I recently finished the Dialogue Cabin quilt behind me. It's by Clarke. And if you follow her on Instagram, she has the best Instagram handle. It's called Hold My Seam Ripper. So that's amazing. It was such a fun quilt to make. And I enjoyed making it. It was just a blast. And the whole time I was making this quilt, I was thinking, gosh, this is a great quilt pattern for linen. And then I was like, oh, this is such a great quilt pattern for solids. And then I was like, I should do a great quilt pattern video on it. And in my previous great quilt pattern videos, I talk about how certain patterns are great for shirts. Like all kinds of shirts, whether they're given to you to make a memory quilt or whether you pick them up because you like the pattern at the thrift store, whatever the case, it's a very specific thing and not every pattern works for all kinds of shirts. And this one is unique in that it is great for shirts, but it's a specific type of shirt that it's great for. And so I want to tell you about that today and go through some of the pros and cons of this quilt pattern. The first pro, in my opinion, is it is actually very easy to make. It has very simple construction. And I mean, it's a log cabin. And that's part of what makes it so funny and so great. That title, Dialogue Cabin. I mean, you know, we quilters love the puns. It's not even a hard log cabin. It's 5 pieces per block, which is nothing in the quilt world, really. So you have your start off square and then the matching square, then the next piece that makes this little white corner inset, and then that original color again. That's it for every block. And what makes this pattern so great is just the configuration of these blocks together makes that white square that either jumps off of the colors or feels like it's back behind all the colors, just depending on what you see. That's it. Such an easy construction, such a great idea, put together really cleverly with a big impact. I mean, that's it. Makes this wonderful thing behind me. And it's a modern design. That to me is a pro. Sometimes it's hard to find modern quilt patterns that are good for really any kind of shirt. I mean, shirts, you're limited in your amount. And so a lot of times modern quilt patterns have a lot of background or a lot of negative space. And so it immediately removes that as an option for using shirts. This one is unique in that it has that young, fresh, modern feel to it, probably because I think Holly is young and fresh and modern. Each block has its own pieces that make it work for shirts. So all of those to me, big pros. So if you're making a memory quilt, for example, for someone who's younger and they don't want that traditional style quilt, or that's just not their, personal style, then this might be a great option. Another pro, in my opinion, is it's great for solids, so solid shirts. And the reason why I said that's a pro is not every man is courageous enough to wear these busy prints, loud colors. A lot of men just have a lot of different solid shirts in their closet, and that's what ends up at the thrift store. And there are a lot of quilt patterns that They may be beautiful with prints, but if you use solids, they don't have maybe that big impact. It's not as interesting without a print to go with it. In this case, this particular quilt pattern, it almost relies on a solid shirt. So let me show you that. An example of that. These are 3 green shirts that I have in my stash. And I just kind of went through all of my greens, and I happen to have 3 that kind of met that gradient ombre category. And I was like, oh gosh, look at that. There is one whole column of the quilt behind me. So if you are a person who maybe you don't realize it, but you naturally lean toward picking solid color shirts, and then you get them home and go, gosh, what am I going to do with all these just plain shirts? Well, the plain is actually the thing that makes this quilt pattern work. While we're talking about it, sometimes you have shirts that maybe aren't completely solid. I actually have a lot of these kind in my stash. So in this case, this is a solid shirt, and this middle one is not solid, but really in practice, it's going to read as a solid because the print is very small. And in this case, it's very spaced out, and not like in the spaced out way, but just in the literal separation of the dots. And I will say I cheated with this. This is a fat quarter that happened to be in my stash. It's called Sea Glass. Oh, it's so beautiful, from Ruby and Bee Solids. But I actually had an Oxford cloth that was very close, but it was too muted and I didn't love it, so I cheated. But if you look at that, that is just absolutely lovely. And from a distance, this will read as that medium value in the gradient. This quilt pattern works for very small prints that are spaced out across the fabric. Let me give you another example of kind of in that same family. Here are some blues that I pulled out from my stash. And my stash is a shirt stash that becomes a fabric stash. These are shirts that have a teeny tiny print on them. That very first one is orange peel. And then this is it looks like a tattersall, but it's actually rotated little squares with teeny tiny stripes in them. This has a herringbone weave in it. And then this one is a very dark blue, almost black, with a medium blue diamond print on it. But you can see with these against each other, these are going to read solid. And so these would be beautifully integrated into this kind of quilt pattern. So the pro to me is if you have, Paul called it a micro print, which I love that. Not just small, but very small. And as a result, you would think it would be busy, but it's actually less busy because it reads as a solid. So these types of shirts are really, really great for this quilt pattern. And I suspect a lot of you, if you do what I do, which is buy men's shirts and quilt with them, you may have some of these and then figure out, oh, how can I use that in a quilt? Well, this is a great time to use them. And for contrast's sake, let me show you perhaps why I say solids versus prints. I love this shirt. I love this shirt. It gives me joy. It has such an interesting print, and it is a very busy, and I wouldn't even say very large, but it is altogether, it has quite a presence with that print. Even though it matches these shirts, if I used this print in the dialogue quilt pattern, it would lose some of the impact and geometrical nature. Geometry. It would lose something. It would lose the clear lines, clear straight lines of the color surrounding the white square, because your eye goes to the print instead of the overall geometry of the quilt. So you might see that as a con, and I will cover that. But for our purposes of pros, what that means is if you don't have a lot of these kind of fun prints in your fabric stash or in your shirt stash, but you do have solids, it's a great quilt for that. So I already said this in the very beginning, but this is a great quilt for linen. And the reason it's a great quilt pattern for linen is it is on right angles. So it's squares and rectangles, and you don't have half square triangles or things on the bias. It's just nice and straight and square. In fact, that's the beauty of the pattern. So it works really well for linen, and you'll see I actually have these are the purple fabrics in the quilt behind me, and I was able to find obviously quite a few ombre linen fabrics to go in that quilt. It just really works because sometimes with linen, you have the interest of the heathered nature of linen that sometimes happens. This second one in particular, it's actually a weave of blue and orange. So again, very much like the micro prints in the shirts that I showed you, the blue shirts that I just showed you. This one is not a solid, but it reads as a solid. So I want to show you some other of the linen options that I picked just, for the heck of it, because fabric. So here's some greens that I put together. Here are some turquoise linen fabrics. We've got some periwinkly blue, periwinkly. Here's gray, and this would actually be considered black linen, but it really reads as a dark gray. And then here's a blue that kind of bridges between this turquoise and the periwinkle, but we're going to come back to this in just a minute. It's going to show up in the con, in our con section. So it works for linen, and I can tell you that it works for linen because the quilt behind me the quilt top is 100% linen. All of that, every color that you see is linen. And it was really a blast to make, and, requires a little starch. I may have said that before. But once I got my linen stabilized, I was able to cut those nice, straight, square pieces. And then there are 5 per block. And it felt like it came together in a weekend. It didn't, but it felt like it. I had to bring the block out again to show you the next pro, which is it uses very little of a shirt. And so to demonstrate that, let me show you this. So this is a yoke from a men's shirt. Clearly has been folded for quite some time. So that's across the shoulders. And you can see that piece will come from here, and this piece will come from here. So if I had another yoke of this size, I've just made a whole block with 2 yokes. For another example, here's a sleeve. This one has been starched as well, so it very much holds a crease. So here we go. There's that piece. Here's this piece right there. And then there's that piece. So if I was very resourceful, which I try to be, I might be able to get 2 whole blocks of the colored pieces out of this one sleeve. Now, this is a pretty big sleeve. But for example, that piece will come from there. Could get 2 of these pieces. Actually, I know for a fact I could get 2 blocks out of the sleeve. I'm looking at it right now going, oh, there it is. It doesn't use a lot of a shirt. And that is great because sometimes you don't have very big shirts. Sometimes you don't have a lot of a shirt. And sometimes you're trying to make one shirt stretch a long way. For example, if you wanted to make 2 memory quilts out of the same sets of shirts that you had gotten from a family. It doesn't use a lot of fabric, actually, which is kind of a surprise because in this case, the blocks are fairly large, but because of the construction, it just doesn't use a lot of shirt. And in my case, I made this with white linen, In our area, you can find a ton of white linen shirts, actually, and a ton of men's shirts that are in the white dress shirt category. Definitely that, at least in our area. Now, you may be in Washington State and be able to find every kind of flannel, but not a lot of linen. But in that case, you could always use a background fabric from Yardage. So just a thought, if you're thinking, well, I really want to do that. While I have this block out, and the last of the pros that I have identified is this particular quilt pattern. Holly Clarke has offered different sizes in the quilt by scaling the pieces. So what that means is, if you're unfamiliar, this particular block is the size block of the ones behind me, which makes a pretty large throw, nice big square throw. There are smaller sizes, and I think there may be even a bigger size than this, and it's based on the piece size. So if you wanted to make a much smaller quilt or a much larger quilt, really all you're doing is cutting your piece sizes bigger. And that's kind of nice because you may not have a lot of fabric and you just opt for a smaller size quilt. So that to me is a pro. Just having those options. It's not like this one size or hit the road, Jack. So let's talk about some cons. And every quilt pattern has its downsides. So this is not a dig on the pattern. It's just some things that make it not great for like a particular type of shirt. And we'll start with the large or busy prints, which I already showed you one example of that in the solids. But here's some examples in linen. This one would work really well because it's going to read as just kind of that gray blue. Even though it's got some texture and heathering in it, it's going to read a single color. This linen, which I used as binding for my personal linen quilt, I love it, but it's very busy. And because it's dark on a light background, if I used this particular fabric in this quilt pattern, then your eye would be drawn to the print itself. And so instead of this ombre, gradient, solid, harmonious with the big impact of the white squares, your eye would go almost directly to this. And it would not have that nice defined part of the square that the solid does. Likewise with this wild fabric right here, this black linen with flowers and vines, if I cut that, each piece around that white square is going to look a little different, which is kind of like that K-facet thing. You know, it's like you cut the same piece of fabric and you can't even tell it came from the same piece of fabric. So there's that. But then also it would not read as black. It would just read as kind of this busy green and black mush, which we don't want mush in our nice, pristine, square dialogue cabin. So the next thing that I would consider a con is that it uses many shirts or several. We have a running debate in our house about the difference between many or several. It's 18 different fabrics. So in this case, and what I'm talking about is that's 18 different shirts. That's a lot of shirts. It doesn't use a lot of the shirt you use, but you have to have a lot of them. And that can be easy or really difficult, just depending on what sorts of shirts are available to you. You may have a charity shop that doesn't have a lot to choose from, or you may be like us and have 4 thrift stores in a 2-mile radius that have so many men's shirts. It's kind of ridiculous and embarrassing for that level of excess. So that to me is a con. If you think about the fact that every shirt has more than a yard of fabric, that's a lot of fabric and a lot of shirts. This particular quilt pattern, the way it's designed, is, as you can tell, following, you may use the word ombre or gradient. So it's a dark, medium, and light value in roughly the same color. That is part of, to me, the joy of doing it, but it can be challenging to find 6 different colors with 3 different shirts in each color in a gradient that works. So that's probably the biggest difficulty I think of using this particular quilt pattern with shirts is that's kind of a lot to accomplish. So what that means is either you may have to compromise your colorway a little, and I would say I compromised in this particular one. This olive green is a little more yellow than this grass or lime green. And so these two go pretty well together. This one is just a little too olive. It works, and I used it. But if I had had my choice, I would not have picked that much of an olive color. The purple one was another example of that. I did not love that medium value. It works, but that was a little bit of a compromise to me. This one's pretty great. This one's pretty great. Sometimes, though, you'll find yourself with, and especially in the case of linen, you may find one that's kind of mottled or heathered. And very often those fabrics are a little on the muted side. And then you have another fabric that is just like pow in your face, vibrant. And so trying to get that ombre or gradient right within a color and the correct value, 6 different colors, can be a little bit of a challenge. I alluded to this, and I will now say what I kind of referenced earlier. You may find yourself with a color combo that's just not quite right. So in this way, we're going from purple to blue to turquoise to green. We'll just pretend like this black and gray isn't out here. This navy to this medium blue is okay, but from this medium blue to this very, very light blue, pale blue, it's kind of a big jump. These are really close in value. This one is kind of a big jump. So if in the case of linen, you want to have, like, you need a blue, you can actually dye your linen to make your colorway work. So back to the con, it's a very specific colorway, and not every shirt will fall into that category. So you either have to be willing to compromise your shirt choices, you have to be willing to perhaps dye, particularly with linen, to get the right color, or you have to be willing to wait and collect your fabrics, which is a lot of what I did with the quilt behind me. I kind of bided my time and just kept looking like, oh, I need a red. Well, let me just see if, and every time I went to the thrift store, I looked. And over time, I was able to collect the bulk of the fabrics. And then I did, in fact, dye a couple of them to make them work in that gradient that I wanted. So that's a con. You can't just like go to the fabric store. Well, you could, because it's a beautiful quilt pattern. But if you want to use shirts, that you're going to have some accommodation to make there. The last con or two is kind of in the construction family. So if you're a beginner sewist, you may find pressing your seams open and then matching your points with open seams a little bit challenging. I love a nested seam. Love it, love it, love it. The way the pattern is written, it calls for open seams, which makes sense because it's got that band of white. And so you want the white to fold on the white and the color to fold on the color. So that means all your seams are pressed open, which means when the blocks come together, you're matching open seams to get your points right so that those squares will come out nice and neat. And that can be a little bit challenging. It's not brutally difficult, but it's also not a total cakewalk. So just know that going in, that making the block is so easy, and sewing the blocks together in columns are very easy because you don't have any points to match up. But when you start sewing your columns or your rows together, getting those seams to match up to make the squares can be a little bit challenging. And then finally, you either need to know your total block arrangement, block and row arrangement before you start sewing, or you need to know that you're going to have some limitation in repositioning your blocks, because the way the blocks are made, this becomes perhaps a bottom right corner of a block. And I can turn the block and make it the top right or the top left or the bottom left. But once it gets sewn into, so here's the one I chose. So once these blocks are made and they're sewn together, now this row is on a singular orientation based on the way the white piece is coordinated. That middle section is either going to be a C or it's going to be an E without the middle bar, so that it makes that square just like this. In this case, if I'd made all my periwinkle blues as C's, then it's going to have to match up with a column of color that has the E so that it makes that square. I actually, in this quilt pattern, decided I wanted to rearrange them once I had made them. And there were really only about 3 choices that I had because the squares had to come together. So if you're a person who likes to make a block and then really play with the positioning of them, there's some significant limitation on how you put it together unless you know in advance how you want it to go. So that's really it. That's my rationale for why this is such a great pattern. It's just a great pattern in general, the dialogue cabin quilt pattern, but it's especially good for linen and solid shirts. And I want to encourage you to explore the possibilities from your fabric stash. Do you have a lot of solids? Do you have a linen that you've been wanting to use? It's great for it, and I think you'll have fun making it. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thank you so much for watching. Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. In today's video, I want to tell you about the dialogue cabin. I was going to say dialogue quilt cabin, which is weird. If I used this, the people who looked at the quilt pattern, I started, you just can't get it together within a color. I'm struggling.